Imagine a queen so cunning, so ruthless, that her name would become a symbol of treachery and evil for generations to come. A woman who didn't just whisper in the king's ear but controlled him entirely. This isn't fiction. This is the true biblical account of Queen Jezebel, arguably the most notorious queen in Scripture. And as we unpack her story today, you'll see how the darkest parts of human nature can twist power into something utterly destructive, and how God's justice, though delayed, is never denied. To understand the weight of Jezebel's influence, we need to start with the man who made her queen king Ahab of Israel. Ahab was already heading down a dangerous path, following in the idolatrous footsteps of Jeroboam. But he took things even further by marrying Jezebel, a pagan princess from Sidon, something the God of Israel had strictly forbidden. But here's the twist: this wasn't just a political alliance. Jezebel wasn't content with being a foreign queen. She brought with her the worship of Baal, fertility god known for some of the darkest rituals in ancient religion. Think fire, blood, and human sacrifice. This wasn't just a woman with foreign beliefs. This was a woman on a mission. Real story parallel, a modern echo of Jezebel's control. You know, Jezebel reminds me a lot of the real-life case of Grigory Rasputin in Tsarist Russia, not a queen, but someone who got so close to power he almost brought down a dynasty. Rasputin, like Jezebel, didn't hold a formal position, but his influence behind the scenes changed the course of history. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers in the dark, and Jezebel? She whispered with poison. The downfall of Israel's soul. Under Jezebel's rule, Baal worship spread like wildfire. Altars were erected. Prophets of the Lord were hunted down and murdered. And all the while, her husband King Ahab watched silently, enabling her evil, sometimes even participating in it. What's even more chilling is how calculated she was. This wasn't impulsive wickedness Jezebel planned. She manipulated. She understood how systems worked and she bent them to her will. Take the story of Naboth's vineyard. Ahab wanted the land, but Naboth refused because of Jewish law. It was his ancestral inheritance. Ahab pouted like a child. And Jezebel? She forged letters in his name, orchestrated a sham trial, and had Naboth falsely accused and stoned to death, just so her husband could plant a vegetable garden. That's not just cruelty, that's bureaucratic murder. Baal's influence, more than idolatry. Let's not forget that Baal worship was no mild religion. It was dark, carnal, and violent. The Bible paints Baal as a deity of fertility and storms, yes, but behind those symbols was a system of ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. Jezebel wasn't just choosing another god, she was choosing a completely different worldview. One that stood in direct opposition to everything the God of Israel stood for. And by bringing Baal into Israel's heart, she wasn't just committing spiritual adultery, she was committing national suicide. Divine judgment is never rushed. Here's where things get real sobering. The prophet Elijah, Israel's boldest voice, confronted Ahab and Jezebel multiple times. He called fire down from heaven, challenged Baal's prophets at Mount Carmel, and ran for his life when Jezebel swore to kill him. Eventually, Elijah prophesied something chilling. Jezebel would die, and dogs would eat her body by the wall of Jezreel. No royal burial, no honor. Just dishonor and decay. And yet, Jezebel lived on for years. This part always gives me chills because it reminds us that God's justice isn't always immediate. Sometimes the wicked prosper for a while. Sometimes the evil seem untouchable, but judgment always comes. Lessons in power, control, and consequence. There's a reason the name Jezebel has endured for millennia. She's not just a character in a story, she's a warning. A warning about what happens when power is unchecked. About how evil can flourish when good people stay silent, and about how God never forgets the cries of the oppressed. In the end, Jezebel's story isn't just about her. It's about what happens to a nation when its leaders reject truth and embrace darkness. And unfortunately, it's a story we've seen replayed in history time and time again. So what does this mean for us? We may not be royalty, we may not be political figures, but we all have influence over our families, our communities, even strangers online. Are we using that influence to build up or to manipulate? Are we silencing truth when it's inconvenient? Or are we standing for something deeper, something eternal? Because like Jezebel, we're all writing our legacy with every decision we make. Imagine a grandmother so obsessed with ruling that she orders the execution of her own grandchildren. It sounds like something out of a dark fairy tale, but it's one of the most chilling realities recorded in the Bible. Meet Queen Athaliah, the only woman in Scripture who ruled over Judah as monarch. But her short reign wasn't marked by justice, wisdom, or care. It was soaked in blood, betrayal, and pure ambition. Today we dive into a legacy so twisted it makes Game of Thrones feel like a bedtime story. Power at any cost. Who was Athaliah? Athaliah was no stranger to power. She was the daughter of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and like her infamous mother, she knew how to manipulate a kingdom. Raised in a palace where deception and idolatry were the norm, she inherited not only royal blood but a thirst for dominance. After marrying King Joram of Judah, she became queen consort. And when her husband died, her son Ahaziah took the throne. But tragedy, or perhaps divine justice, struck quickly. Ahaziah was killed in political turmoil, leaving a power vacuum in Jerusalem. And that's when Athaliah made her move. Real story parallel, history repeats itself. Throughout history, we've seen monarchs and dictators cling to power through terrifying means. Catherine de' Medici of France, for example, orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, killing thousands to secure Catholic dominance. Power, when corrupted, has always come with a body count. Athaliah's story fits that mold perfectly. Except this time, the targets weren't political rivals. They were her own grandchildren, the massacre of the royal family. Upon her son's death, Athaliah saw an opportunity to rule not as a regent, but as queen in her own right. But there was a problem: the royal lineage. The Davidic line, God's chosen dynasty, was still alive in her grandsons. So she made an unthinkable decision. She ordered the execution of every royal child, her own descendants, to ensure no one could challenge her claim. The level of spiritual blindness and emotional coldness required for such a move is hard to grasp. She wasn't just eliminating threats, she was erasing the future. And for a moment, it looked like she had won, but one child survived. In a twist of divine protection, one child escaped the slaughter. Joash, a baby at the time, was hidden away by Jehoiada the priest and his wife Jehosheba, who was actually Joash's aunt. They raised him secretly in the temple for 6 years while Athaliah ruled with an iron fist. It's here the Bible reminds us that even in the darkest of times, God is never absent. Behind palace doors, power may look absolute, but behind temple walls, God was preparing a comeback. The impact of Athaliah's reign. Athaliah brought Baal worship into the heart of Judah, desecrating sacred spaces and silencing the voices of faith. Her reign wasn't just politically corrupt, it was spiritually devastating. She stood as the last thread of Jezebel's influence in God's holy land, and her grip was suffocating. But like every tyrant before and after her, her reign had an expiration date. When Joash turned 7, Jehoiada the priest led a secret coup. Guards were posted, trumpets were blown. And the rightful king, though still a child, was crowned in the temple. Athaliah heard the noise and rushed in, screaming, "Treason! Treason!" But it was too late. The people had chosen covenant over corruption. She was captured, taken to the city gate, and executed. Her reign ended where it began, in violence. But now, justice had the final word. The power of influence, grandmothers, mothers, and matriarchs. Athaliah's story is extreme, but let's not miss the deeper message. Women in Scripture often held incredible influence, whether for good or evil. Think of Hannah, whose prayers shaped a prophet, or Mary, whose faith brought the Messiah into the world. Athaliah took that same capacity for influence and used it to destroy. In our own lives, we may not be monarchs or rulers, but the influence we have, especially within our families, is enormous. What we pass down matters. Bitterness, ambition, pride, these don't stay with us, they ripple outward. But so do love, mercy, and faith. The bigger picture, preserving the promise. Athaliah tried to destroy the Davidic line, a direct attack on the messianic promise. Remember, from David's seed would come the Messiah Jesus. If she had succeeded, that prophecy would have been broken. But God is never outmaneuvered. Through Jehoiada's courage and Wash's preservation, the lineage continued. And centuries later, out of that royal line, Christ would be born not in a palace, but in a manger. Athaliah's evil reminds us that there's always a bigger battle playing out, one that goes beyond thrones and crowns. It's about God's purpose and the enemy's attempt to stop it. If Jezebel represents spiritual seduction, Athaliah represents generational destruction. Her story is a cautionary tale about how brokenness, if left unchecked, doesn't just haunt us, it devours those we love. But it's also a story of redemption, of hidden hope, and of how one faithful priest and one brave woman saved a generation. Let's be the people who break cycles, not repeat them. Let's be the Jehoiada in someone's story, the one who protects the promise, even when it costs us everything. What happens when the shadow of evil lingers long after the villain is gone? We've looked at the horrifying reigns of Jezebel and Athaliah, two queens who left behind legacies drenched in blood, idolatry, and betrayal. But in this final part of our journey, we're going to explore the aftermath. How did their actions shape future generations? And what hope, if any, did God provide in the midst of such darkness? The Bible docent just tells stories of evil. It shows us what happens when God steps in to redeem what feels beyond repair. Generational echoes, how Jezebel and Athaliah shaped a nation. Long after Jezebel's body was devoured by dogs and Athaliah's blood stained the gates of Jerusalem, the ripple effects of their lives were still felt. The damage they caused wasn't limited to their lifetimes. It spilled over into the cultural and spiritual climate of Israel and Judah. Jezebel introduced Baal worship to Israel, influencing not only her husband, but the entire nation. Even after her death, prophets continued to warn against the same seductive idolatry she promoted. Athaliah, likewise, imported the same spiritual decay into Judah, threatening the very line from which the Messiah would come. Her decision to destroy her own grandchildren for power didn't just cost her a crown. It nearly cut off the future of redemption itself. Real-life example, breaking the cycle. Let's bring this closer to home. There's a story of a woman named Lisa raised in a home where manipulation and control ruled. Her mother, much like Jezebel, knew how to twist emotions and make others feel powerless. Lisa grew up swearing she would never become like her mother. But years later, as a parent herself, Lisa realized she was controlling her own daughter in subtle, yet eerily familiar ways, demanding perfection, punishing disobedience with emotional withdrawal, using guilt as a weapon. The truth is, legacies, especially broken ones, are hard to outrun, but they are not impossible to break. Lisa made a decision. She sought counseling, surrounded herself with faith-based support, and began reshaping how she loved and led her daughter. It wasn't perfect, but it was redemptive. Like Lisa, we all inherit patterns. The question is, do we pass them on, or do we let God transform them? Redemption begins with one decision. In the wake of Athaliah's tyranny, it wasn't a military general or a king who stepped up. It was a priest, Jehoiada. He wasn't a warrior by trade, but he had courage fueled by faith. He risked his life to preserve the royal seed and restore covenant worship in Judah. This is the power of one person's faith. You don't need a crown to shift a kingdom. You need conviction. Jehoiada's quiet courage saved the Davidic line and ultimately ensured the arrival of Jesus. That's the weight of influence. Even when evil feels overwhelming, God always raises someone up to protect what matters. The surprising role of women in redemption. It's easy to focus only on the evil women in these stories, but Scripture also lifts up powerful, faithful women who did the opposite. Take Jehosheba, for instance, Athaliah's own niece, who hid Joash from her murderous aunt. She was royalty, but she chose righteousness over family loyalty. Her brave decision preserved the future king and changed the course of Judah. Or think of Esther, who used her influence in a foreign palace to save her people from annihilation. These women didn't just stand in the background, they stood in the gap. In every generation, there are people, often unexpected, who act as bridges between chaos and covenant. What does this mean for us? It's tempting to read these stories and think, that's ancient history. But if we're honest, the spirit of Jezebel and Athaliah still exists today, in systems that elevate control over compassion. in families where silence covers abuse, in cultures that worship image, influence, and self above all else. The names may change, but the heart behind it is the same. And yet the answer remains unchanged too. God's truth, His justice, His mercy, His redemption. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to say yes to being part of the story God is writing, one that transforms fear into faith and brokenness into legacy. If there's one thing these biblical queens teach us, it's this: influence is never neutral. You don't need a crown or a title to lead. Your words, your choices, your love, it shapes generations. The legacy of Jezebel was one of fear and idolatry. The legacy of Athaliah was bloodshed and betrayal. But the legacy of those who stood against them, Jehoiada, Jehoshaphat, Elijah, was restoration, truth, and courage. Which will your legacy be? The Bible isn't afraid to show us the darkest parts of the human story, but it's never without hope. Evil may sit on the throne for a time, but God is always working behind the scenes, raising up hidden heroes, preserving His promise, and bringing light into the shadow. So today, if you feel caught in the middle of a generational pattern, a family battle, or a spiritual fight, don't lose heart. You may not feel like a hero, but your decision to stand in truth and love can change everything. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs encouragement. You are part of a much bigger story. Thanks for watching. Stay strong, stay faithful, and I'll see you in the next one.